I work as a nighttime tour guide at an old penitentiary in the countryside, a place infamous for housing some of the country's worst criminals back in the day. The prison is now run by the local historical society, and the tours are more on the tame side, family-friendly, mostly, so nothing too intense ever really happens. The tours run twice a week, from about 6 to 9 at night, and I've had some unsettling moments during my time there, but nothing quite like this. I've never been the type to believe in ghosts or the supernatural. But if there's anywhere that could change your mind, it's this place. Everyone who works there has their own creepy stories. The custodian claims he's seen shadowy figures in the corridors, the security guard swears he hears whispers coming from the cells at night, and the curator says he's felt a cold chill in the execution chamber on more than one occasion. As for me, the scariest experience I've ever had happened one Friday night, while I was leading a group of about 30 people into what we call the execution chamber, the room where condemned prisoners were hanged. The room itself is small, with thick stone walls, but the roof is made from old corrugated metal sheets. The tour was going smoothly, and I was in the middle of my usual speech about the room's history when, all of a sudden, there was a massive bang on the roof. It wasn't just a random noise either, it was loud enough to make everyone freeze and look up. A few people screamed, others nervously laughed, probably assuming it was part of the tour. Sometimes we have actors who jump out to scare guests, so I imagine they thought it was part of the act. But the banging didn't stop. It kept going, irregularly but steadily, boom, 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 boom. The sound was getting to me, and I could see from the group's reactions that they were on edge too. The room suddenly felt a lot smaller, like the walls were closing in. So, trying to keep things under control, I led the group outside, making some excuse about needing fresh air. Once we were outside, I stepped back to get a better look at the roof. It's an A-frame style, so from the right angle, you can see the entire thing. That's when we all saw it. A section of the tin roof was actually moving, like something, or someone, was stomping on it from the outside. The banging continued, the sheet bending and warping under the weight of whatever was up there. I didn't want to alarm the group, so I tried to move us on quickly to the next spot, but I couldn't stop glancing back at that roof. The banging eventually stopped as we finished the tour, but a few people kept asking if it was part of the experience. I could tell by their nervous laughter that they weren't entirely convinced. But here's the thing, it wasn't part of any planned act, and it genuinely terrified me. I've heard strange noises in the old penitentiary before, but never anything like that. Whatever it was, it left an impression on me, and even though I'm still skeptical about ghosts, that night made me question things. The next day, I went to the curator, a man named Mr. Thompson, a kindly old chap with a passion for local history. He listened patiently as I told him about the incident, but he didn't seem overly surprised. "Ah, yes," he said, stroking his chin. "The execution chamber has a bit of a reputation, you know. We've had a few reports of strange goings-on in there over the years." He told me about a previous tour guide who'd claimed to have seen a shadowy figure hanging from the rafters, and how he'd once heard a disembodied voice whispering from the corner of the room. He even mentioned an incident where a group of visitors had reportedly felt a sudden rush of cold air, despite the room being sealed tight. I was surprised to hear that there had been other strange occurrences, but Mr. Thompson seemed to take it all in stride. "It's just an old building with a lot of history," he said, shrugging. "There's always going to be a bit of a strange atmosphere in places like this." His calmness was unsettling, but I tried to dismiss it as just his way of dealing with the paranormal. I told myself that it was probably just the wind, or maybe even a bird that had gotten trapped in the roof. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was at play. That weekend, I was again working the tour, and as we approached the execution chamber, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. I tried to ignore it, but my heart was pounding, and my palms were sweating. I was trying to keep my cool, but I was also starting to get a bit too aware of everything around me. The shadows seemed to be deeper, the sound of my own footsteps seemed louder, and I could feel the eyes of the group on me. When we entered the room, I could feel everyone's gaze drawn to the roof. I tried to reassure myself that it was just the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. As I started my usual speech about the room's history, I could feel my voice trembling a bit. "This room was used for executions for over a century," I began, my voice strained. "And in that time, many men and women, met their final fate here." The words were coming out, but I could feel my confidence wavering, my voice getting tighter. I glanced up at the roofing, the corrugated metal sheets, and the shadows lurking within their crevices. "In fact," I continued, trying to maintain my composure, "the last hanging took place in 1947. They say that some of the condemned prisoners actually requested this location. They felt it was better to be hanged in the presence of the Lord." I saw the visitors looking up, their faces pale and uneasy, and I forced myself to continue. "Because they believed that their souls would be lifted to heaven by the rope." And then it happened. A thud. Then another, followed by a series of bangs. The sound echoed through the room, deafeningly loud, and the room seemed to shrink, the heavy stone walls closing in around us. The tour group gasped, their eyes wide with fear. "It's just the wind," I said, but my voice was weak, unconvincing even to me. The tour group, however, was not convinced. They were staring up at the roof, their faces a mix of fear and curiosity. I could feel a cold chill running down my spine. I wanted to get everyone out of there, but I didn't want to scare them. So I decided to make a joke, hoping to defuse the situation. "Well, it seems like we've got ourselves a bit of a show," I said, trying to force a smile. "Maybe the ghosts are giving us a performance." But the banging continued, growing louder and more frequent. It was no longer a series of isolated thuds. It was a relentless rhythm, a pounding on metal that was starting to make my heart race. I glanced at the group again. Their nervous laughter had died down. Now they were just staring at the roof, their faces full of fear. I took a deep breath. I needed to get them outside, and I knew I couldn't explain it away as wind or birds or anything else. So I decided to play it off as a planned part of the tour, a little surprise. "Okay," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "This is just part of the tour, right?" I tried to make eye contact with a few of the visitors, hoping to get a nod or affirmation, but they just stared at me, wide-eyed and worried. "This is the special part of the tour where the ghosts come out to say hello." I gestured with my hands, trying to sound upbeat. "They're just excited to see you." They didn't respond, but the silence was thick, heavy, filled with unspoken fear. "So," I continued, trying to keep my voice steady, "let's head outside now." I led the group out of the execution chamber, my heart pounding in my chest. As we made our way out into the courtyard, I glanced back at the roof, the corrugated metal sheets. I could see a slight movement, as if something was pressing down from above. Even the moonlit night seemed to be getting darker. "It's just the wind," I said again, trying to convince myself as much as the group. But the fear was starting to take root in me, spreading like a weed. As we continued the tour, I tried to keep my composure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, my senses heightened, my heart pounding in my chest. I was starting to think the old stories about the penitentiary were true. After the tour ended, I went back to the execution chamber. I didn't see anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there. I took a deep breath and decided to try and rationalize it. I went up to the roof, hoping for a logical explanation. The roof was made of old corrugated metal sheets, and I found a few loose screws and some minor damage, which I figured could have caused the banging. I spent the next hour replacing screws, tightening connections, and taking a look at the structural integrity of the roof. I found the damage, but the source of the banging was still a mystery. Still, I felt a little better once I had completed the repairs. It gave me a sense of control, a small but significant victory over the fear that had taken root in my heart. But I also knew that I wasn't going to be able to ignore it completely. I've always been a skeptic, but that night had shaken me to my core. The banging on the roof, the feeling of being watched, the cold chill in the air, it all added up to something more than just a coincidence. Over the next few weeks, I found myself on edge, looking over my shoulder, constantly on the lookout for something out of place, a shadow in the corner of my eye, a sound in the silence, a chill in the air. I decided to start keeping a journal, writing down any unusual occurrences, any strange feelings, any whispers in the shadows. I felt a strange need to document it all, to give it form and meaning. I began to take a closer look at the old stories about the penitentiary. I spent hours in the library, poring over old newspaper articles, court transcripts, and prison records. I learned that the prison had been a haven for some of the most notorious criminals in the country, and that many of them had died within its walls, some by their own hands, some at the hands of the state. I started to see the stories differently, not as spooky folklore but as echoes of the past, remnants of a brutality that still lingered in the walls of the old penitentiary. I learned that the last person to be hanged in the execution chamber was a man named Jacob Crane, a notorious bank robber who had murdered a police officer during a daring escape attempt. He was a charismatic figure, and his execution had been a major news event. I could still find newspaper headlines about his trial and execution all over online. I imagined Jacob Crane in the execution chamber, waiting for his fate. I imagined the fear, the terror, the anger. I imagined his last moments, his last breaths, his last words. I started to sense the weight of his story, the burden of his death. The more I learned about Jacob Crane, the more the banging on the roof seemed to make sense. It wasn't just a random noise. It was a message, a plea, a reminder of the past. It was the ghost of Jacob Crane, trying to tell his story, trying to be heard. I was still skeptical, but I was also starting to understand. I started to think of the old penitentiary not as a place of spooky stories, but as a repository of memories, a place where the past still lived. And I was starting to believe that sometimes, the past can make itself known. That belief, that understanding, gave me a sense of peace. It helped me to accept the strange things that I was experiencing, to see them not as a threat but as a connection to something larger than myself. I continued to work as a nighttime tour guide, and I still told the stories of the old penitentiary, the stories of the criminals who had lived and died within its walls. But now I told them with a new understanding, a new appreciation for the power of history, the weight of memories. I knew that I wasn't alone in experiencing the strange occurrences in the old penitentiary. I knew that others had felt the cold chill, heard the whispers, seen the shadows. And I knew that the banging on the roof was not just a random noise. It was a story waiting to be told. Maybe even, it was a story waiting to be understood. I still don't know for sure what happened that night in the execution chamber. I may never know. But that night changed me. It made me open my mind to possibilities that I had never considered before. It made me realize that even in a place like an old penitentiary, even in a world obsessed with logic and reason, there is still room for mystery, for wonder, for the unknown. And sometimes, maybe, the unknown is just trying to get our attention. It was a typical Tuesday night when the weirdness started. I was in my bedroom, sorting through some old family photos I'd found up in the attic. The room was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of the pages and the soft hum of the ceiling fan. Everything seemed normal until I heard it, a faint scratching noise coming from my closet. At first, I brushed it off as the house settling or maybe the closet doors shifting. But when the scratching didn't stop, I started to get uneasy. My heart started racing as I tried to think of a logical explanation. Was it an animal stuck in there? Or something worse? I glanced over at the closet. The door was slightly ajar, letting in a sliver of light from the hallway. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but the scratching just kept going, now accompanied by the occasional creak, like something, or someone, was moving inside. I took a deep breath and walked over to the closet. The scratching stopped suddenly. My hand was shaking as I reached for the handle, every creak of the floorboard seeming louder than usual. I hesitated, my mind running through all the possible scenarios. Could it be just an animal, or was something more sinister at play? I finally pulled the door open. The closet was crammed with old clothes and boxes of forgotten stuff. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I leaned in, squinting into the dim interior, my fingers brushing against dusty hangers. Out of nowhere, the scratching started again, but this time it was way closer. I froze, feeling my breath catch. I looked down and noticed something that made my blood run cold. Claw-like marks scratched into the wooden interior of the closet. A wave of dread hit me as I realized these marks weren't just scratches. They looked like they'd been made by something with real talons. I stepped back, feeling a rush of panic. The scratching stopped, leaving the room in an eerie silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, so I decided to dig a little deeper. I grabbed my phone and used its flashlight to check out the closet more closely. The more I looked, the more it felt like I was uncovering something I wasn't meant to find. The boxes were filled with old clothes, books, and knickknacks, but nothing seemed out of place. Then I spotted something weird in the back of the closet, a small, ornate box pushed behind a pile of old coats. It was intricately designed, with strange symbols carved into the metal. I couldn't help myself and carefully pulled it out. The box was cold, and as I opened it, I found a bunch of odd items, a tarnished locket, some old photographs, and a small, leather-bound journal. The journal was worn out, its pages yellowed. I flipped through it and found entries describing disturbing events, people going missing, strange happenings, and eerie warnings about a dark presence. The last entry was the creepiest, detailing a creature that would come out of the shadows, attracted to those who uncovered its secrets. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I read the last lines. It waits in the dark, scratching at the walls, yearning to be let out. Don't open the door. Don't let it out. Just then, I heard a noise behind me. I spun around and saw that the closet door had somehow swung shut. My heart pounded as I tried to open it, but it was stuck. I pushed and pulled with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. As I struggled, I noticed a faint glow coming from the closet, seeping through the cracks. The scratching noise started up again, louder this time, mixed with a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the walls. Panic set in, and I frantically tried to force the door open. Finally, the door swung open with a loud creak, and I stumbled backward. The closet was empty, the strange box and its contents gone. The scratching had stopped, leaving only a heavy silence. I stood there, breathing heavily, trying to figure out what just happened. The journal was nowhere to be seen, and the closet looked normal again. The feeling of being watched lingered, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Over the next few days, the weirdness only got worse. The scratching noises kept up, but they weren't just in the closet anymore. They followed me around the house, getting louder and more frantic. My once cozy home now felt unsettling and strange. I reached out to a local historian who knew about paranormal stuff. She was intrigued and agreed to help. After looking at the box and the journal, she told me it was likely linked to an old legend about a spirit or entity that could be stirred up by curiosity, or messing with its relics. According to her, this entity had been bound to the box, and by interacting with it, I had made it more active. The scratching was its way of trying to break free from its prison. With her help, I performed a cleansing ritual to drive the presence away. The process was intense, but it seemed to work. The scratching noises stopped, and the heavy feeling lifted. In the end, I learned a valuable lesson about the dangers of delving into things that are best left alone. The experience left me with a lingering sense of unease, a reminder of how thin the line between reality and the supernatural can be. The night had an unusual bite in the air, the kind that makes your skin prickle and leaves your breath hanging a little too long in the cold. It was late, pushing 10 p.m., and I had somehow convinced myself to drive out to the old house. Everyone in town knew about it. It wasn't some secret haunted spot people dared each other to visit. No, it was worse than that. It was forgotten, like everyone chose to act as if it didn't exist. Maybe that's what intrigued me the most. A house sitting just outside of town, abandoned and silent for years, and no one ever seemed to care. The house wasn't completely isolated, but it was far enough from town that it felt like stepping into a different world. It stood there, weathered by time, sagging under the weight of its history. From the road, it was barely visible through the overgrown weeds and twisted tree branches that seemed to reach toward the roof, almost swallowing it whole. I parked a bit further down the road, where the gravel faded into cracked asphalt. For a moment, I sat there, staring at the dark silhouette of the house, the faint outline of its roof jagged against the moonlit sky. I wasn't scared. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. I wasn't a believer in ghosts or any of that supernatural nonsense. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching me, daring me to step closer. Maybe it was just the way the shadows fell over the windows, creating the illusion of eyes, or maybe it was something more primal. An instinct. A warning. Curiosity has a way of making you do stupid things. That's what I told myself as I got out of the car, closing the door softly, as if not to disturb the silence around me. The crunch of gravel under my boots sounded too loud in the stillness. No wind, no insects, nothing. Just dead, heavy silence. It settled over me like a weight, making each step toward the house feel deliberate, like walking through thick mud. The porch was in worse shape than I had expected. The wood was old, weathered, with cracks running through it like veins. My foot pressed down on the first step, and the wood groaned, a deep, unsettling creak that made me wince. I froze, waiting for something, anything, to break the quiet. But nothing did. The air hung heavy, unmoving, like the world had stopped breathing. I moved up to the door. It was old, paint-peeling, barely hanging on its hinges. I wasn't even sure it would open. I stood there for a long moment, just staring at it, my mind racing through a dozen reasons not to go in. What was I hoping to find? There wasn't any legend or mystery surrounding the place, just whispers of abandonment and neglect. And yet, something about the house felt wrong, as if it had a life of its own, its memories buried deep in the cracked walls and broken windows. I reached for the doorknob, expecting it to be stiff or rusted shut, but when I touched it, it turned easily in my hand. The door creaked open with little effort, like it had been waiting for someone to come along and push it open after all these years. That was my first real warning. Something wasn't right. No one had lived here for as long as I could remember, and the place had been boarded up tight. So why was the door so easy to open? I stepped back from the threshold, heart pounding harder than I wanted to admit. The smell hit me first, a musty, stale odor, like old wood and something sour, something rotting. The darkness inside seemed to stretch on forever, the shadows thick and suffocating. I squinted, trying to make out anything inside, but it was useless. The house swallowed the moonlight, leaving nothing but a void. That's when I heard it, a soft shuffling sound, just beyond the doorway. Not footsteps, not the sound of the wind, but something deliberate, like someone, or something, moving inside. My breath caught in my throat, and I instinctively backed up a step. There shouldn't have been anyone in there. The house was empty. Abandoned. Yet, the sound was unmistakable, like fabric brushing against the floor, or the slow, careful movement of someone trying not to be heard. I stood frozen, my hand still on the doorknob, as the shuffling stopped. Silence again, thick and oppressive, pressing in on all sides. I waited, my heart hammering in my chest, every nerve on edge, expecting to hear it again. But the only sound was the blood rushing in my ears. I wanted to close the door, to pretend I hadn't heard anything, to walk away and never think about this place again. But something kept me rooted there, some part of me needing to know. Maybe it was the adrenaline, the thrill of doing something reckless, or maybe it was just plain stupidity. I couldn't tell anymore. All I knew was that I had to see inside. But I didn't. I stepped back, heart racing, and turned away from the house. I don't know why. Something deep inside me, instinct maybe, told me to leave. Whatever was in that house, I didn't want to find out. Not tonight. Not ever. As I walked back to the car, my steps quickening, the uneasy feeling stuck with me, growing with each step. I glanced back at the house once, just once. And I could have sworn I saw something move in one of the upstairs windows. A shadow, a flicker of movement, gone as quickly as it appeared. It could have been my mind playing tricks on me, or it could have been something else. I slammed the car doors shut and started the engine, peeling away from the house faster than I cared to admit. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white as I sped down the dark, empty road. The house disappeared in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the night, but the feeling that had settled in my gut didn't go away. 4 days afterward, I couldn't shake the sense that I'd narrowly avoided something worse than I could have imagined. The house wasn't haunted by ghosts or demons, it was haunted by something far more tangible. Something human, something dark, and dangerous. I try not to think about what might have been inside, what had made those shuffling sounds, but my mind kept circling back to it. Maybe it was just squatters, or some drifter taking shelter in the abandoned house. But the way the door opened, the silence around me, the movement in the shadows, it all felt too deliberate, too planned. Like someone was waiting. Watching. I never told anyone about that night, not because I was scared they wouldn't believe me, but because I didn't want to believe it myself. I avoided that part of town from then on, driving miles out of my way just to stay clear of the place. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't escape the feeling that I'd left something unfinished. That house, that night, it stayed with me, lurking at the edges of my mind, a dark corner I couldn't quite shake. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind dies down and the house is quiet, I swear I can hear that same shuffling sound just outside my window. But I never look. I had always been drawn to abandoned places. There was something about the solitude of these forgotten spaces that intrigued me. I spent countless hours exploring derelict buildings, finding beauty in decay. It was a hobby that bordered on obsession, and it led me to many strange and unsettling encounters. But none was as haunting as what I discovered one cold November evening. The warehouse on the edge of town had been a fixture in the community for decades, its purpose long forgotten. Once a bustling hub for local industry, it had fallen into disrepair after the company shut down. Over the years, it became a local legend among thrill-seekers and urban explorers. Stories of strange noises and eerie sights surrounded the place, but I always dismissed them as exaggerations or the product of overactive imaginations. One evening, as I walked home from my job at a local bookstore, I noticed the warehouse standing forlornly in the distance. The setting sun cast long shadows, and the building's silhouette looked particularly ominous. I was on my way home, but something made me pause and consider investigating. I'd passed by the warehouse countless times, but tonight, it felt different. The air was crisp, and the temperature had dropped significantly. I wrapped my coat tighter around myself and approached the entrance, a heavy metal door that hung slightly ajar. It had been years since anyone had used it, and the door creaked ominously as I pushed it open. The scent of dampness and neglect filled my nostrils, but I pressed on, my curiosity piqued. Inside, the warehouse was a labyrinth of empty spaces and discarded remnants of its past. Old machinery lay covered in a thick layer of dust, and broken windows let in slivers of the waning daylight. My flashlight cut through the gloom, casting sharp beams across the desolate interior. As I walked deeper into the building, the temperature seemed to drop even further, and the silence was almost oppressive. I made my way to the far end of the warehouse, where I noticed a faint flicker of light coming from a partially covered window. The light seemed out of place in the otherwise dark and empty space. I approached cautiously, trying to discern the source. As I neared, I saw that the light was coming from an old office at the back of the building. The door was slightly open, and the flickering was coming from a lamp on an old desk. Stepping inside, I was struck by the contrast between the dim, dusty room and the warm glow of the lamp. It was as if the office had been frozen in time. Papers and old files were scattered across the desk, and a few chairs were arranged around it. The room seemed strangely intact compared to the rest of the warehouse, and it was oddly comforting in its own way. But then I noticed something that made my skin crawl. On the other side of the room, there was a large frosted glass partition that separated the office from another area. The glass was covered in grime, but I could make out distorted shapes pressed against it. My heart began to race as I moved closer, my flashlight illuminating the frosted surface. The figures on the other side of the glass were difficult to make out clearly. They appeared as silhouettes, their shapes contorted and distorted by the frost and grime. Their hands were pressed against the glass, as if they were trying to push through, and the sight was deeply unsettling. I couldn't see their faces, but the desperation in their posture was palpable. I took a step back, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. The room felt colder, and the shadows seemed to grow longer as the daylight faded. My breath was visible in the air, and I shivered despite my thick coat. I could hear a faint scratching sound, like fingernails dragging across the glass, but when I looked closer, there was nothing there. The sense of unease grew stronger as I stood there, the figures on the other side of the glass becoming more vivid in my mind. It was as if they were trapped in an eternal moment of panic, their silent cries for help echoing in my ears. I felt a mix of fear and empathy, but I couldn't understand what could have caused such a sight. I tried to push the door open, hoping to find another way into the room beyond the glass partition. The door was locked, and I could see no way to access the other side. My frustration grew as I pounded on the door, but there was no response. The figures remained pressed against the glass, their desperation unchanged. As the minutes ticked by, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The temperature in the room seemed to drop even further, and the shadows seemed to close in around me. I was alone in the warehouse, and the eerie silence was broken only by the faint scratching sound that continued to torment me. The figures on the glass seemed to move slightly, their shapes shifting and writhing as if they were struggling to break free. Finally, unable to bear the tension any longer, I decided to leave. I turned and hurried out of the office, my heart pounding in my chest. The warehouse seemed even darker and more oppressive as I made my way back to the entrance. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figures following me, but there was nothing there. When I reached the street, I took a deep breath and tried to calm my racing heart. The cold night air was a welcome relief, but the sight of those figures remained etched in my mind. I knew that what I had seen was not some supernatural phenomenon, but something far more unsettling. It was a reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the corners of the human experience, hidden away and forgotten. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I tried to learn more about the warehouse and its history, but my searches yielded no useful information. It remained a mystery, a dark chapter in the town's history that had been sealed away and left to rot. Despite my attempts to rationalize the experience, I couldn't escape the haunting impression left by those faceless figures. I knew they were not real people but a product of my own fears and the chilling atmosphere of the abandoned warehouse. Yet their silent plea for escape lingered in my thoughts, a reminder of the fear and vulnerability that lie beneath the surface of our everyday lives. Now, whenever I pass by the old warehouse, I feel a shiver of apprehension. The building stands empty and silent, a forgotten relic of the past. But in my mind, the figures are still there, pressed against the frosted glass, their silent cries a haunting reminder of the darkness that can be found in even the most ordinary places.